After having problems for 2 years, Mercedes has put a completely new car on the track for this year's championship. The team hopes to get closer to Red Bull. The new front wing with its legality wire made headlines right away. Mercedes used a carbon fiber wire to connect the nose by the second flap to the fourth flap, which made the design legal. But that's not the only cool new thing about the W15. Mercedes has also made the front suspension more flexible. With an extra upper rear wishbone leg, the design lets the team better adjust how the car is set up for each track. During preseason testing, Mercedes tried out different setups for the upper rear wishbone. For the first 2 days, it was kept higher, but on day 3, it was lowered. Tech boss James Allison is sure that the W15 is better than the one that came before it. The bouncing is still a thing that's going to be a threshold that all the cars in the pit lane will work up against until this generation of car moves on to something different. So there is still some bouncing that we can bury ourselves in or come out of just in pursuit of what the right performance compromise is. But the sort of horrid, snappy rear end, that is happily not troubling us in the way that it did in the past. It's mostly mechanical changes in the car, but it's always a marriage between the aerodynamic behavior through the corner and the suspension. This picture did, however, show a hint at a new flexible arrangement that will be built into the Mercedes chassis and front suspension this year. The team can change the inboard end of the suspension leg to get the best setup for each circuit thanks to this design. Most teams have some flexibility in this area, but it's usually measured in millimeters instead of the few centimeters that Mercedes has with the W15 solution. At first, it's hard to tell, but the hatch on the side of the W15's chassis is bigger than we're used to seeing. Depending on the position, it lets different wishbone configurations be used, each of which has its own kinematic and/or aerodynamic effects. The back leg of the upper wishbone was mounted higher on days 1 and 2 of the preseason test by Mercedes, but it put it lower on the list for the third and final day to judge its qualities. The arm is now moving forward compared to the position it was in for the first 2 days of the test because of this change. The arrangement used on day 3 of the test brings the back legs of the upper and lower wishbones much closer together. This likely makes the pair work better as a single aerodynamic surface. James Allison said the following about the changes. "We were changing the anti-dive level on the front suspension. That's exactly the sort of change that you really can't do between runs and practice sessions. Useful to get that done and get a bunch of runs on it today, compare it to yesterday, and make our decisions." Another crucial change of the new Mercedes contender is the cockpit position for the driver. That is about 10 centimeters farther back than in the cars that came before. This is possible because the fuel tank behind the cockpit is shorter and a bit taller. The 2022-23 cars had a lower and longer fuel tank, which helped keep the center of gravity lower. This will have raised the center of gravity, especially when the tanks were full. However, there are other benefits that outweigh this in the overall set of trade-offs that must be made when designing a racing car. Also, it's important to note that the fuel tank is not exactly 10 centimeters shorter, even though the cockpit is 10 centimeters farther back. This is because the gearbox housing has been shortened to make room for the cockpit to be moved. Last year, Lewis Hamilton was very vocal about how the W13 and W14's cockpit layout didn't give him a good sense of what was going on in the back of the car. However, the main reason for the change was to make the cars more aerodynamic. Getting the exposed upper side impact bar, also called the SIS bar, as far forward as possible was a key part of the previously forward-sighted cockpit. This was because the aerodynamic sheath around it was used to push air down and along the floor edges. For this redirection to have the best effect, it had to happen as far ahead as possible. Because of how the size requirements were set, the SIS bar could reach further outward in that part of the car than if it had been placed further back. After a rough start to the season, Mercedes is now on the defensive. Putting them down, even when they are weakest, is a bad idea, as history has shown. They can use the low expectations for next weekend to their advantage and try to make it to the podium. At least Mercedes is excited about a race weekend this time. This is especially true now that testing of the new idea seemed to go well. Because of this, Mercedes said that the stark contrast between this season and the one it has seen between the wind tunnel and the track with their 2024 Formula One car is a good one. Mercedes has promised to completely redesign its next challenger, the W15, after its first season without a win since 2011. At the beginning of last season, the German brand chose to keep the zero-pod option, but a rough winter made them give up on that brave new idea. Mercedes said right away that its main goal was to make a kinder car by getting rid of the spiteful rear-end features of its wild W14 model. And it looks like they did just that. Lewis Hamilton and George Russell think the W15 is nicer to drive than its stubborn predecessor, even though they know Red Bull is still out of reach. Allison has said the same thing again, saying that Mercedes can now focus on making the cars perform better, instead of fixing ones that are giving them trouble. Toto Wolff gave the W15 a good review after testing it, and finding that it was much better to drive, and most importantly, matching their data. After missing the championship race for 2 years, Mercedes has changed the way their W15 looks, giving it a more traditional look while still adding a lot of new technology to the front wing in the hopes of opening the door that puts them back in the running for the title. And now that Mercedes has finished 3 days of testing in Bahrain, they can share some good news on that front. Lewis Hamilton and George Russell were often frustrated with Mercedes' previous contenders in this ground effect era, the W13 and W14. Neither was a lot of fun to drive, and the operating window was painfully narrow and unpredictable. But it looks like the W15 has broken that trend. Before the first race of the 2024 F1 season in Bahrain, Wolff said that Hamilton and Russell are much happier with the balance of the W15. This challenger is also doing what Mercedes' simulations said it should, which was another problem with the 2022-23 cars. A new season brings new opportunity, and it's exciting to be heading into a new campaign with all the drama it will inevitably bring, said Wolff. Each of the last 2 seasons, we've headed to the first race of the year on the back foot. There was inherent goodness in the W13 and W14, but it often proved too difficult to unlock. They were inconsistent machines. Our main aim going into 2024, therefore, was clear: create a consistent and stable platform. A car that would react as we expected, one that the drivers could consistently push, and one that we can develop throughout the year, in the knowledge that we are bringing real-world performance to the track. Even though Ferrari set the overall pace of testing, those 3 days in Bahrain aren't always the best indicator of which challenger is the fastest. Wolff said that the W15's focus can now shift to performance since the Bahrain International Circuit is hosting the first race of the season. After testing, most people agreed that Red Bull was again in first place with their unique RB20. Wolff agreed with this theory and thinks Mercedes will end up somewhere in the pack of cars that are trying to catch them. Our focus at the test was on learning about the car we have, Wolff continued. Our attention can now turn to tuning performance for the Bahrain race weekend. Red Bull, as is to be expected, look to be at the head of the field. The chasing pack looks tight. We will soon get an idea of where we stack up in that, and the task that is ahead of us to close the gap to the front. So, what do you think? Will the teams be much closer to Red Bull this year? Let us know in the comments down below.